I'll also add that I'm an actually engineer, so that's my background is engineering, and I used to design and build offshore oil platforms. So I have a slightly different take on some of these issues to some of my colleagues, perhaps. So I've called this talk here a velvet or a violent, which it was a violent climate revolution. Which one will we choose? And it's deliberately a slightly provocative title, but I'll try and come down to at the end, why I conclude that that's the situation we're in. So this is, unfortunately, it's not a very upbeat talk. So I do apologise in advance for that. So I'm going to start by asking, what is our concern over climate change? I'm assuming if you've come today, you've all got quite a reasonable grasp of some of these issues and you've got your views on some of these things. But really, we're not interested in temperature. We're interested in impacts, whether that's flooding or fires or droughts or famines or whatever it might be. We're interested in the impacts of climate change and other ecological and social challenges that we face. So it's not temperature. It's not about 1.5, 2 degrees centigrade, 3 degrees centigrade or 4. We use this language, particularly us as academics and experts use this language all the time. It's really unhelpful, but unfortunately we're locked into it now. But it's not about temperature. It's not really about impacts. It's about the rate of change of impacts. If those impacts happened over 1 million years, so what? If the impacts occur over 5 years, you've got devastation. So it's the rate of change of impacts. Then the question we have to ask is, can human systems, can societies adapt to such rates of change? Because these changes are going on and accelerated by our activities. What's the impact for other ecosystems? Which we're part of, even though we're reluctant to admit this, I think, we're part of other ecosystems. We're completely dependent upon them. Temperature is just a proxy for impacts, for rate of change of impacts. It's temperature over a certain period of time that we're looking at. So it's about the rate of change of impacts over a particular period of time. And I think we also have to ask the question, who is the we in this? Who's the we who thinks about these issues, thinks about what impacts are acceptable and what impacts are not? That we, I think, is hugely important. I'm just going to point out that climate change, this is, again, probably the things you all know very well, but climate change isn't a threat. And that was pointed out to me in the Glasgow COP a few years ago by a young activist from Indonesia. It's a lived reality for these people, even if they don't necessarily call it climate change. So this is from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the big UN body that look at these things from their last set of reports, when it points out that increasing weather and climate extreme events have exposed millions of people to acute food insecurity and reduced water security. So losses of food production and access to food have increased malnutrition, and in all regions, extreme heat events have resulted in human mortality and morbidity. So it's a real world problem that's occurring today and has done for quite a long time. So it's not a threat about the future, which is often the language, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, we often talk about that sort of language of being a threat. It's a reality. So what is driving the climate change that we're witnessing? So I'm trying to think about this from a sort of sciencey point of view, really. And our concern is it's the CO2, the carbon dioxide concentrations, principally, the main greenhouse gas. These are rising at unprecedented rates. And when you plot these on a graph, I think it's quite telling. If you look at across the last, look at the concentration in the atmosphere in parts per million, that's the measure we use, parts per million of carbon dioxide. And you look at that out for the last, say, 800,000 years or so almost 3 times as long as humans have been on the planet. Compare that with today. You get a plot that looks like this, of the carbon dioxide concentrations going up and down. And broadly, it follows the ice ages. There's a few things in there, but broadly, it's up and down with the ice ages. And the difference between the top and the bottom is a difference of about 100 parts per million. That's the unit we're measuring it in. We then go to this little bit at the end here, the last 10,000 years, and that's really the period where human society has flourished during that period in relatively recent time. The CO2 levels have been incredibly stable. So human societies have flourished with only a 20 parts per million variation. So very, very little at all. And that means we've had a relatively stable climate, relatively stable temperatures. That's what's allowed us to develop, become civilized. I'm not sure that either of those words are really appropriate, but anyway, modern society has come out of that. This is where fossil fuels began. We started burning them. The concentration in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per million, there or thereabouts, in 1850s-ish. And if we look at what's happening, that's where we are now. So you start just plotting these on a graph starts to tell you something that this looks a little worrying, to say the least. We're now at 424, probably 425, something like that, parts per million. And we've driven temperatures up compared to the pre-industrial period by about 1.5 degrees. Again, that's really an unhelpful temperature. I mean, it could be 1.5 degrees warmer or colder in Shrewsbury tomorrow. So it's not a helpful frame, but as a global average, it's a huge and incredibly rapid change in the amount of energy in the atmosphere. So we are creating profound changes to the climate. Just when we use these units, they're not particularly helpful, but we're sort of locked into these sort of temperatures now. And temperatures only stop going up when we stop burning fossil fuels. So cutting back on fossil fuels doesn't mean temperatures go down. Cutting back on fossil fuels means temperatures go up, just maybe not quite as quickly as they were before, though that's not necessarily the case. So we have to actually eliminate fossil fuels. Fossil fuels have to be eliminated. We have to stop emissions going into the atmosphere. The way we're going at the moment, it's highly unlikely that we'll be able to hold to anything less than 2 degrees centigrade of warming, which looks pretty devastating in so many respects. But now there is a small, but very real and not insignificant risk that we could be heading towards 3 and 4 degrees centigrade in this century, within this century. You know, it's within the lives of perhaps some of us here, certainly our children and our grandchildren, will be living through the legacy of our choice to do very little about climate change. And the prospects of 3 or 4 degrees centigrade of warming, I think, from everything we can understand about how the climate works, and that means how our insects operate, so how they pollinate our crops, whether we've got food or whether we fight someone else for the food, all those other sorts of things that are layered into a modern society, is that we're looking at things that a climate that's extremely unstable, far beyond any safe zone that's nurtured civilization, unprecedented societal and ecological chaos. I mean, it will stabilize again, but it'll be a long time away, and it won't care about us in the interim. Escalating geopolitical instability and increasing military tension, and no real economy. So when these strange organizations tell us about the economy will be reduced by 8% or 7%, what is this? I mean, if you're at these sorts of temperatures, there is no economy to think about. We are in systemic collapse. So let's not take any too much notice of we'll be affecting the economy by a few percent. That's not the world that we're talking about with these sorts of temperatures. So with that as a backdrop, what has the international community agreed to do about things? What are we committed to do on climate change? And I am focusing here on climate change and particularly on energy. But climate change is one of a suite of ecological challenges that we face. Well, back in 1992, and when I'm talking to students, they think that was like, you know, in the dark ages, but quite a few of you here were probably here in 1992 by the looks of it. So back in 1992, most nations of the world signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Climate change, unfortunately, is full of these terrible acronyms. So that's the big sort of original convention that all of the following COPs, these big events that occur every year, they follow on from this original foundational document. And in that document, there are 2 key articles that are important, I think, for tonight's talk, but important more generally. The first of these is in the fancy language we like to use, that's stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent anthropogenic interference with the climate system, dangerous anthropogenic. Put simply, it means cut the emissions to avoid dangerous levels of climate change. And the second one introduces the concept of international equity, which has been absolutely key right through then, but even though every rich country has taken no notice of it, well, lip service, but no real notice of it. And there it has this awful sort of rubric of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Put simply, cut emissions fairly, and that means that developed countries, relatively wealthy countries, have to take the lead and cut emissions faster and sooner than the poor countries. And they've got to help the poor countries in that as well. So they're the 2 really key articles, if you like, within the UNFCCC. I also think it's worth bearing in mind that science, though people often say listen to the science, you should listen to the science, but science cannot define what's dangerous. Scientists might define what's dangerous, but that's a human. So a scientist in Sweden may take a different view to a scientist in Bangladesh as to what's dangerous. So science can inform that debate, and so it should do, but ultimately what is or is not dangerous, what is or is not acceptable is a political decision that we all have our views and we engage through whatever processes we have, however poor they may be, to come up with a collective view as what is dangerous, which I hope is informed by science, but we can't define scientists. Oh, and also, I mean, it comes back, and I'll come back to more of this as we progress. You know, who makes a decision? Who says what's dangerous? Is it a poor person living on the coastal strip in the global south somewhere, or is it a rich person at Davos that chooses what's dangerous? Now, that was a long time ago. We had in 1992, the UNFCCC. It was 23 years before we actually defined what do we mean by dangerous? There was a lot of poker playing and all the other nonsense that went on in between, unfortunately. And in Paris in 2015, we defined dangerous as to hold to well below 2 degrees centigrade of warming compared to the pre-industrial period and pursue no more than 1.5. And that was the 1.5 was pushed then very hard by the poorer parts of the world, particularly some of the small island states and so forth. And they were given sort of like second billing, if you like. So we'd have this bit about 1.5 on the end. I was quite surprised. I was in there checking the drafts at the time, along with some other colleagues at Paris, and we were quite surprised when that turned up. They also said we would be guided by science and that we would reduce emissions on the basis of equity. In other words, this common but differentiated responsibility, CBDR, this fairness issue internationally. But Paris, of course, has used this sort of language of adjectives like, well below, pursue, and all these sort of things. But really, as scientists, we like playing with numbers. We have to convert that into something. What does that mean to help us play with numbers? So well below, now it's broadly accepted, and it's that funny language, I agree. That's an 83% chance of staying below 2 degrees centigrade. That's the sort of language we use to give these probabilities. You can have long discussions about how meaningful these are, but so it's a good chance of staying below 2. But actually, when you think about it, well below 2 degrees centigrade doesn't mean a good chance. I mean, it would think that is a 100% chance, you would think, really. But you can't have that, unfortunately, because we've left things too late. And for 1.5, it's a 50-50 chance. That's not a great probability, really, when you think about it. Now, that was in Paris. That's how it was framed. But since Paris, and you might argue we should have done this before, but since Paris, the scientific community has done a lot of work on what are the impacts for 1.5 compared with 2. You thought that should have gone first, and then you come up with the temperatures you want, but we've done it the other way around. We've come up with the temperatures, then said, well, can you tell us a bit more about the impacts? And so there was a lot of work done. There's been a huge amount of work done on impacts since Paris that's been really helpful. And if we look at the COP26, this is Patrick Vallance, who was the government's chief scientist at the time, saying it is crucial that 1.5 is kept alive. This is not negotiable. So it's true to say that I think that the 1.5 framing has almost become the dominant framing because we realise the impacts at 1.5, between 1.5 and 2 are significant. There are probably quite a lot of what you might commonly call tipping points, non-linearities, feedbacks in the system between 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. The higher temperature you go, the greater the risk of those tipping points taking over and leaving us, what we do is less relevant. So there's a real risk between these temperatures. So 1.5 now is seen really as being, we shouldn't go any more than that. As we come to later, unfortunately, we left that too late. So what reduction pathways, emission reduction pathways are there that sort of meet our commitments? And this now brings the science back down to the politics, if you like, and this is where things get murky. The science can tell us quite a lot about the scale and the timeline to cut our emissions in line with our political commitments of 1.5 and 2. First, and it's really important to grasp this, and again, most of you probably understand this anyway, what really matters in terms of temperature is not some end date, but the build-up of carbon dioxide. So when we put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it basically stays there. Some of it gets taken out by the oceans and by the biosphere, but at least half of it stays there, in a sense, permanently. It's there pretty much forever. It doesn't really come out of the system in any sort of decent human time frame anyway. So it builds up, so it accumulates. And what the science can then tell us, for a given temperature, it can give us what we call a budget, the total amount of carbon dioxide we can dump in the atmosphere to give us a reasonable chance, a certain probability of a certain temperature. And it can give us the numbers, how much that is. And that then can tell us roughly how many tons of fossil fuel can you burn, how much coal, oil and gas. And that also says something about agricultural emissions as well, which I'll just touch on now. I'm not focusing on agricultural emissions tonight. They're very important. They're probably something like 20% of the warming we've seen so far. It comes from agriculture. It's a hugely important part of the issue. Energy is the main concern, but in the shorter term, in some respects, agriculture is very important because it puts out a lot of methane emissions, and that has a big warming impact in the near term. I'm going to focus mostly here on energy, though, but we have to do something about agriculture, and that means diet and agricultural practices and norms. So the IPCC provide us a whole set of carbon budgets for 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade. Now, I've simplified this down into one table here. There are some tables, not many graphs in this plot, in this talk. So if we're looking here at 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade with these chances of it, can you all see that from the back? Okay, and I revised these budgets, these carbon budgets, the total amount of carbon dioxide we can emit from now out to basically forever. I've revised it with the latest science and taken up to the start of January. Well, when I first did this, we were last year, but now we're already partway through, over halfway through January. So this was from the start of this year. That's how much we can emit. They're not too precise, they give you a good feel for the amount. And that's 130 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide for 1.5, up to about 530 billion tonnes for 2 degrees centigrade. Now, they give you a good handle on the amount you can emit. But that means nothing to most of us here, I would guess. That's 3 years to 13 years of current emissions globally. This is globally. 3 to 13 years of current emissions for those. And remember, emissions are not going down. Emissions are still going up globally. They're going up every year at the moment. So there's no sign that emissions are going to come down significantly in the short term anyway. So 3 to 13 years. If we look at a reduction rate, an exponential rate, if you try to say we reduce emissions every single year, so we didn't exceed these budgets, for 1.5 degrees centigrade, at a global level, you'd have to reduce emissions from the start of this year, and we're already late on this, by over 20% every single year. 20%. The UK's managed the odd 2 or 3%. During COVID, the peak of COVID was about 5%. You have to do this every single year, 20%. But even for 2 degrees centigrade, you're talking about 7.5, a little bit more than 7.5% every single year to stay below 2 degrees centigrade of warming. So no country's achieved anything like this. Nothing, not even approaching it. This is at a global level, starting about, what's the date today? I don't know, 21 days ago or something. 22 days ago. If you were to draw straight lines down to zero from today, or from January the 1st, you'd have to be zero emissions globally at 2031 for 1.5, and by 2050, there or thereabouts, for 2 degrees centigrade. That's if you started at the 1st of January doing that. And because we're not doing that, we're going up still. We're using up the budget about 2.7% every single month for 1.5 degrees centigrade and 0.7% every single month for 2 degrees centigrade. So while we've been organising this talk, we've gone through quite a few percent of the budget. I've blanked out the 1.5 here, and I say that with a very heavy heart because we've failed on 1.5. And if you take the microphone away from any analyst who works on climate change, they'll tell you the same thing. We've failed on 1.5 degrees centigrade. And what does that mean? That means we've chosen to sacrifice the lives and the livelihoods of many people, particularly in the global south. Poor people, voices are very seldom heard, very low emissions, and typically people of colour. And we've actively and knowingly chosen to sacrifice their lives so that we can carry on with our norms, high carbon norms in the global north particularly, but also other parts of the world as well. Lots of wealthy people elsewhere in some of the poor countries. Carried on business as usual. So I think this takes a bit of stopping and reflecting on what we mean when we say we've failed. And to add to this, there's some emerging evidence now that warming may be accelerating slightly faster than we thought. And that's because when we put the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, not quite so much of it is being taken up by the oceans, and some of the biosphere that was taken up is not taken up as fast as we thought. So it looks like we're starting to see more of the CO2 remain in the atmosphere. And that makes the situation significantly worse. And also, as we're cleaning up the aerosol pollution, particularly from burning fossil fuels, then that acts as a coolant at the moment, reflecting sunlight. As we clear up those particulates, that means we get an additional warming that was hidden before. So this says that we need to urgently increase our emergency level climate response. What emergency level climate response? So, I say, unfortunately, there's very little good news in this. So that's the global picture, but we were committed to deliver our reductions on the basis of equity. So that was a key part of this. And so following that sort of language in the Paris Agreement and every agreement going back to 1992 between developing country parties and developed country parties, and the UK is just about in the developed country parties, I think. So you can divide the carbon budget between the two. This isn't to scale at all. And then you can say within the developed country parties, how much should somewhere like the UK get? Now, there's quite a lot of assumptions have to go into this. But I and colleagues have done quite a lot of work on this, and other people have elsewhere in the world. And what I've tried to do here is to simulate this via the last paper I was involved with and update this again to January this year for the UK. We've done the same thing for Sweden. We've done it for quite a few countries now. We can also work out budgets for cities and so forth, but the smaller the geographical boundary, or if it's a company, the more uncertainties are there, the more assumptions you have to embed. So this has taken it down to the UK, and I would still say this doesn't really fit with Paris. It's still not particularly fair. Now, I'm focusing here on the 2 degrees centigrade. The 1.5 ones are in the bottom, but as I say, they're no longer achievable. in my view. So the UK can emit about 2 to 2.5 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide from now out to forever. That's 7 years of UK emissions. Remember, this is for 2 degrees centigrade, not 1.5, for our fair contribution to Paris. That's an annual reduction rate of, well, 13% or higher, depending on what you include in the budget. 13% every single year from the start of this month. And if you were to draw a straight line down to, it would be 2039. So, you know, phenomenally fast rates of change that we're not even touching on in this country, but we pretend we are. So you often hear the language of, isn't the UK, I get the same thing as Sweden and Denmark and every other country as well, isn't the UK showing leadership? We've cut our emissions by, halved our emissions compared with 1990, and I checked this again tonight. This statement is still regularly made by the Committee on Climate Change, by politicians, by, what's his name, Starmer, when he was at COP just before Christmas. If you include aviation and shipping emissions and our imports and exports, the UK has reduced its emissions by about 20, I think it's about 22% now, depending quite how you measure shipping emissions. About 22%. So that's about since 1990, not 50-odd%, which is what the latest 54% the government's using now, I think. That's about 0.6% every single year. Remember, we need about at least 13% every single year. And so far, we've managed 0.6 since 1990. But yeah, the UK can hold its head in shame, but then so can Denmark, France, Sweden. There are no progressive countries in the global north. There are very few progressive countries on climate change anywhere. I'm asking here to just, whenever you hear headline statements, and that might be even on programs like More or Less, you know, you question them. Just think of the context behind them, you know, what's been said. So the UK in the COP29, not the last one, the year before, announced a new UK target of 81% reductions by 2035, I think it was. That 81% is compared with 1990 for a start. It excludes international aviation and shipping. And anyway, it wasn't a new target. It was already part of the Net Zero 2050 framework. So it wasn't a new target, and it didn't include aviation and shipping. But then look at the spin you get by the Prime Minister on these things. And this is not just true of the Prime Minister, but others as well. This is the speech November, just last November at the COP, where he points out that's why, and it's quite a long speech, it's online, you can go and look at it. That's why I announced our world-leading nationally determined contribution. In other words, our level of reductions. Every country in the world had to produce an NDC, a nationally determined contribution. In other words, how much they're going to reduce their emissions by. So our promise, our world-leading promise on reducing emissions is aligned with delivering the Paris Agreement in full. That's why it's in full. And it's about limiting temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade. I mean, that is just patently wrong or dishonest. But look at this political spin by the experts. Remember, the policymakers are reliant on the experts to be honest and not pander to political sensibilities. The previous CEO of the Committee on Climate Change, now the government's top climate advisor, just before he left the Committee on Climate Change, in an interview he gave, I think it was quite widely interviewed, to a group of journalists, but I think it might well have been a focus on the Telegraph, but he's clearly not trying to scare the horses. But that's not his job, in my view. If you're a person going about your day-to-day life in Britain right now, I don't think your day-to-day life will be that different in 2050 when we hit net zero. You'll still be driving your car, you'll still be warming your house, you'll still have a job that's which is probably very similar to the one you have now. It's not frightening, you can still fly off on holiday each year, you can still have a steak if you want to. There's no huge shift here. Remember, it's 13% per annum for 2 degrees centigrade for the UK. He's talking about 1.5 here. Now, no wonder the Prime Minister says what the Prime Minister says. No wonder the journalists spout the nonsense they spout. Because they're told by the experts, and the academics don't question this, because these people set the agenda, which gives us our funding. So you have to really dig quite deep to see what's going on. And it's just often just the science and maths takes you quite a long way on this. Colonialism, and that particular previous chair of the CCC didn't like it when I called it this, but I think this is what we're doing. And of course, the Brits are pretty good at colonialism. The UK government and the Committee on Climate Change claim that net zero 2050 and the balanced pathway to it is the UK's fair role for not exceeding 1.5 degrees centigrade. Yet just look at the amount of emissions that are under the pathway that the government and the CCC have broadly got, and you have to if you take the global 1.5 degrees C carbon budget, so we've got the total budget for the whole world, you divide it amongst 8.5 billion people, and then add that up to every country, the UK would have to get 3 times its fair equal per capita share for 1.5. Now, how on earth can you call that fair? Why should the UK get 3 times the global average? Just because it's the UK. I mean, we have signed up that we should help the poorer countries. We should be ahead of the poorer countries. Here we're saying, no, hang on a second, we want a lot more, because we are the UK, by the way. So, as I say, we stole their minerals, we stole their population, now we're stealing their carbon budget. Even for 2 degrees centigrade, we're failing on the equity commitments. So the framework the UK has is nothing like what we need to deliver. And I would say virtually every academic who works on this knows that's the case, but will stay quiet about it. So against that framing, I want now to start to say what would something approaching a 2 degree C future, bearing in mind that I'm not saying that that's appropriate, but that's probably the best that we can achieve now. And I'll be really surprised if we hold to 2. What would be a reasonable sort of framework for delivering on that? Before doing that, I was been requested by someone who works on adaptation to point this out, that the decades of denial and delay have left us facing the crisis that we were at least pretending to avoid, the crisis we've chosen to downplay. We now have to prepare for disruption of 2, 3 or 4 degrees centigrade of warming. So when we think about planning, we have to sort of think about those sorts of futures. It's not just about what we think is going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years, because you're locking in infrastructure for a very long time, and heaven knows what that's, when you start to think through what does that mean for our society. So you have to have deep adaptation as well as deep and immediate mitigation. So deep changes to our infrastructure and our norms and how we live our lives and how we deal with the climate in which we live, as well as massively cutting emissions. So we're now looking at Paris compliant mitigation. Now, the 2 things here, first, that technology is an absolute prerequisite. We definitely need massive shifts in our technologies and massive deployment, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I'm not just saying that because I'm an engineer, but I'll show you why I think that's important. But after 30 years of failure, and this is what a lot of people don't like to admit, 30 years of failure on climate change, technology cannot do it for us. It is a prerequisite, but it's far from sufficient. So you now also need the bit that no one wants to talk about, is profound shifts in social norms. And that's not a socialist argument. Some people try and say it's just a maths argument. If you want to stick to 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, and they're the agreements we've signed up to, if we assume we're not lying when we sign up to those things, then the technology cannot deliver it in the time frame you have. You have to have both of these. So on technology, we need to differentiate between what I've called delay technologies, and these are designed to avoid effective legislation, and they maintain generally a thriving oil and gas industry, and that's not just here but elsewhere as well. And timely technologies, ones that are actually designed to work at scale, and we know how they work today, that we already have them. So the delay technologies, the first one I'm going to touch on is, I'm going to touch on 3 of these tonight. The first one is carbon capture and storage, which basically means you can carry on burning fossil fuels in power stations and you capture the carbon as it goes up the chimney. And don't ask about anyone who likes thermodynamics, ask the entropy issues associated with this utter madness. But anyway, it's technically achievable. We can do this. It's madness, but it can do it. We've had at least two decades of promises from the fossil fuel industry that it's just around the corner and it's cheap. And lots of their academic shills have also said the same thing. Right? So over 2 decades on, you go to the CCS Institute's latest report and look at it. Last year, or 2024, sorry, it captured 11 million tonnes globally. That's 0.03% of fossil fuel emissions after 20 years. If you look at the CCS Institute, I think it's going to get to about 30-odd million tonnes by 2030, last time I looked anyway. So it's going to go up to something like, I don't know, 0.3% or something of all emissions. So there is no real sense that CCS is going to capture very much in the important time frame to deal with climate change, which is over the next really 10 years. CCS on cement, carbon capture on cement, is important. Cement is a really important commodity, and it has a lot of embedded emissions in the chemistry of making cement, not just the energy, but the chemistry. About 4% of global emissions comes from the chemistry in making cement. There are some things you can do about that, but also you still need a lot of cement. So CCS on that is going to be needed, and in many respects is much easier to do than it is on energy. The other thing you might have heard about, which this government loves, that's, well, a lot of the time I think the problem is people who are excellent in PPE at Oxford or Greek or whatever it might be are not particularly good at technologies, and it's easy to hoodwink them. And if you go to any of the conferences, the party political conferences, you'll just see all the technologies that are there. and with huge stands and people in suits who can just waffle nonsense to people who don't understand anything they're talking about. And blue hydrogen is another one of those, like CCS. Blue hydrogen is basically making hydrogen, which is seen to be a zero greenhouse gas. I'll tell you in a minute, it's not really. You make it from natural gas, so you can carry on with the natural gas industry, which is really the point of these things. You probably have to make it more from liquefied natural gas, so we'll be importing liquefied natural gas. And that has lots of methane slippage. In other words, methane leaks in the process of making LNG and transporting LNG, and that methane has a very high carbon footprint. It's also reliant on carbon capture and storage, which we have not got at scale. It's not working anywhere at scale. There are reasonable sized pilot plants now, but that's all they are. They're not been running for very long either yet. It has very high energy consumption because you've got to get the gas, you then got to liquefy the gas, transport it across the planet somewhere, and then you've got to reheat the gas with the gas to put it back in the gas pipeline. And if you say it, it sounds mad sometimes. And so you have to have that. So it's very high energy consumption in producing LNG and in the transporting of it. And hydrogen is actually, we need some hydrogen for some things. It's a really important gas for some chemical industries. But the idea of combusting this is a bit mad, really. It's a very expensive gas to make. It's very difficult to store it. It's the smallest molecule we've got pretty much, and it tries to escape everywhere it possibly can, so it can wheedle its way through the atomic structures of pipes and vessels and things. And it has a very, very high indirect global warming impact. So although people say it has no global warming impact, directly it doesn't. But its chemical action in the atmosphere means it does have an indirect warming impact, which is about 30 times more powerful than carbon dioxide in the 1.5 to 2 degrees C time frame that we're to look at now. So it is a really important greenhouse gas. That's almost ignored. Most of my climate academic colleagues who work on energy aren't even aware of this. When you point it out to them, they're quite shocked. They thought it was zero sort of global warming impact. Hydrogen is not. And then the last of the three I'm going to touch on is something called negative emission technologies, carbon dioxide removal. It keeps changing its name every time someone figures out it's another magical technology. Engineered removals, it's quite commonly called now. This is where our children, our great-grandchildren, are going to suck billions, in fact, most of the models, hundreds of billions of CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it somewhere deep underground so we can carry on flying and driving our cars and not doing it about climate change today. And this is embedded in virtually every single model that's out there, including the UK's Net Zero 2050 model or analysis. At the moment, and this is from last year, globally, we captured about 0.6 million tonnes that we stored geologically. That's 0.0014% of all fossil fuel emissions. So again, it's a pilot scheme. It's a little thing that Bill Gates can put some money on so he can carry on flying one of his private jets and say how well he's doing. It's that sort of world, this negative emissions. But it's everywhere now in the models. It's completely normalized. So firstly, it relies on carbon capture and storage, which, as I said, it's not been demonstrated to work at scale in any affordable at scale in any way, and certainly not in any affordable way. And it's embedded in every scenario. If you look at it, say, billions of tons of carbon dioxide removal is assumed to happen by 2030, and collectively, hundreds of billion tons are supposed to occur across the next number of decades. And its principal purpose there is not to be a real technology. Its principal purpose is to avoid making difficult near-term political decisions. And those of us who want to get funding do not want to suggest things that are politically difficult, because then we won't get the funding. We won't get the gong. We may not get promotion. So it all plays back. So the academics, we are not neutral in this. Look how many climate academics have got a gong of one sort or another. And then see how often you hear them countering government positions strongly. So then they'll say there's the timely technologies. And these are ones that, I've used it. I'm not a great fan of war metaphors, but this is a post-war metaphor, so I'm a bit happy on this one. This is the Marshall, it was done for a lot of political reasons, but the physical restructuring of Europe after the Second World War, after we blew it all up, then we try and rebuild it all. So Marshall-style deployment is what we require. Marshall-style deployment on steroids is what we require. So it's much more than that. And they're all the things we know how to do. There's nothing exciting here. Retrofit existing homes. Yeehaw, that's really exciting, isn't it? Insulation. That's what we need to do. It's actually quite difficult to do. I mean, to do it properly, you have to train people, which you don't like training technicians in this country. Heat pumps and so forth. Building zero carbon homes. So no new house should be built that requires any heating. But the housing industry in this country is so deeply conservative that it's not prepared to do that, even though it's not that much additional cost to do it. Rapid rollout of public transport. EV charging for the rural environments, possibly rental cars rather than ownership. I would say, we can talk about this later if you want to, I'm not a great fan of EVs in the cities. You know, why do we think that 80 kilograms, in my case, should get in a car that weighs 2,000 kilograms to drive a few miles to pick up some groceries? You know, we've normalised a mad system in our urban environments, and EVs aren't going to solve that. But they've got a role. Rapid shift to zero carbon electricity. Remember, electricity is only about 18% of the energy we consume in the UK. About 82% of the energy we consume is not electricity. So when people say we're doing really well on power, what they mean is we're doing really well on that 18%. So about half of the 18% is now renewable. But we've got the other half to get, and then you've got the other 82% that's not electricity. So we're going to have to electrify a lot more of the system. So we need a massive electrification program as well. So these are all things we know. And on aviation, there are no neat technologies around this. The industry hates this, and politicians don't like it because they always think that aviation is good for the economy, even though there's virtually no evidence to show that's really the case. From a 70% of flights in the UK are tourist flights, or for tourism. And if you look at the ONS data, I don't remember the exact numbers now, but the money that flies out from tourism is about twice as much as the money that flies in. So we lose something like, I think it's 30 to 40 billion pounds a year of tourist money that goes out. And it's understandable. Most people want to go somewhere warm. You know, a few people want to pop along and see Buckingham Palace, but you know, most people from abroad, but most of the time it's British people flying somewhere for a slightly warmer environment for a little while. So aviation, there are no technologies in the near term, so we have to cut demand. But on shipping, there are things, slow steaming, wind assist, there's a whole suite of things you can do. But in all of these things, there's demand management as well. All of these take a while to deploy. Even if you had a Marshall-style plan, you cannot put these in place fast enough to stay within your carbon budget. So as I say, they're a prerequisite, but they're far from sufficient. And this is the bit that then becomes really difficult. In the interim, we need profound social change. And we are having some profound social changes, so perhaps you just have them tailored in a more constructive direction. And absolutely at the centre of this, which again, the academic community, and by and large, the community as a whole does not want to talk about, is the focus needs to be on high-income, high-emitting households. I said us, because I often speak at places where people are very wealthy. I've no idea about Green Party members in Shrewsbury, but you can make your own decision on that. Now, fairness is key, and again, it just comes, you can forget your moral code. If you think we want to stay to 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, just do the maths. This is my take on this again. Look at the inequalities. Collectively, the top 1% of global emitters have lifestyles that give rise to almost twice the level of emissions of the bottom half of the world's population. You have to sort of stop and think, that can't be right. This has been checked repeatedly by lots of people. So, you know, the top 1% have carbon footprints twice as big as the bottom half of the world's population. In the UK, the lifestyles of the high-income households in the UK use nearly 5 times more energy than those of the lower-income households, 5 times more, and that basically means a lot more CO2. It's almost 5, it's about 4.5, I think. So, on responsibility for emissions, let's be absolutely clear. We're not all in this together. The UK households, most UK households, are locked into structural emissions. Rented house, poor quality house, inefficient car, poor heating system, the old fridge. These are things that a lot of people are locked into. They can't buy solar panels. They can't afford a retrofit of 30,000 quid for a terrace house, or 70,000 pounds for some of them. They can't afford this. And anyway, they're not responsible for most of the emissions. And I think this is really important. If we can get this across, then perhaps we can start to point out that this is not the sort. When you get the Farage and other people lying about these sorts of things, saying, "Oh, you're going to be really expensive for you." What he really means is, I don't want to make changes to my life because it should not be expensive for these people. These people should not be making the changes in their lifestyles. In fact, for some of these households, I'd like to see their emissions go up, because in the short term, if the emissions go up, that means they're warmer in their houses, which means they've got less bronchial problems for their children and the older people living in them. So let's see their emissions go up in the short term in those houses. That means mine have to come down even faster. So there's a quid pro quo in this. So who's responsible? Are the discretionary emissions that are locked in to the high-income, high-emitting households that we have, again, completely normalised. And this is where you need urgent legislation to drive down our energy use. We know from the data we use far more energy than the poorer houses. And that's even though their poor houses are rubbish. I mean, they're really hard to heat. From a heating point of view, their houses are very bad, and often the slightly wealthier of us, our houses are not much worse than theirs from a heating point of view, but ours are drier and warmer and nicer. But from a travel point of view, particularly and from a consumption point of view, we use far more than they do. So we need, well, as I say, that fair and deep reductions in energy are another prerequisite of Paris. So one is about the technologies that already exist, and the second one is about deep reductions in energy use by the high emitters. This is important for a number of reasons. First, if we were serious about this and you put this in place very rapidly, I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but nothing on climate change is easy. We're in this position. Then you could deliver immediate and substantial cuts in emissions. Many of us could make big cuts almost immediately. Do we really require that flight off in the winter rather, for a bit of summer sun? Or as me as a cyclist, put my bike in a plane and zap it off to Mallorca or something to go cycling on some nice roads in the warm part of the world. Do we need that? No, we can do without that. So there are lots of things that we've normalised in our lifestyles. But the other good thing about it, it buys us critical time to accelerate the deployment of these technologies, because the technologies will take a long time, or take quite a long time to put in place. But so it gives you more time for that. And the other absolutely essential thing, which is never talked about, where are the white vans? The people that are trained to do things in our society. They're in the posh parts of town, renovating bathrooms, doing something in the garden, and all sorts of other technical things, other sort of luxury things we have done to our already pretty fancy houses. But these people need to be making trams, putting in the buses, putting in the cables, putting up the wind turbines, retrofitting our houses. There's a whole suite of things these people need to be doing, but instead, they're improving the private luxury of people like me, which I'll come back to in a second. Responding to climate change is very different to what a lot of people suggest, I think. For the majority, even in wealthy countries, is win-win-win, and I don't generally think those things exist. They will have to have more comfortable, affordable houses, because they've got to be low carbon, so you've got to retrofit their houses. Otherwise, they can just carry on burning the gas that they're doing today. So you've got to bring the emissions down, so you've got to retrofit the houses so they end up being much more comfortable. You've got to have high-quality public transport, because they can't be driving around in their rubbish cars. They can't afford the EV. So you've got to put these things in place. But that means you've got lots of secure and valued employment, apprentice, trained employment, not a call centre. So there's lots of work out there in this as well. It also gives you better air quality with better health conditions, which means that your educational attainment of your children will be better, because we know damn well that poor quality housing and bronchial conditions are really problematic for children's education and for older people's health as well. I think it helps us move towards having much more of a functioning infrastructure, which we don't have now. I mean, it's just squalid and getting worse. And I think, being optimistic here, there's a sense of improved civic well-being if you think of it moving along these sorts of lines. The problem for this, and this is the rub, this is why we never talk about it, I think, is that we'd have to move the resources and the labour that furnish the private luxury of a relatively few of us, still a significant minority, a significant group, but a minority nonetheless, to the public well-being for all. So it's a future of private sufficiency and public luxury, which is exactly the opposite of what we have now, where we have private luxury for a significant minority and public squalor for everything else, whether it's our roads, our rails, our transport networks, our health system, the state of our hospitals, the state of our schools. I mean, whatever it is, if it's public, it's basically crumbling. And that's not to say that people aren't in those services are doing a fantastic job. But of course, there's a massive swathe of people against this agenda. And this is from a few years ago with Mark Carney when he was the UK's ambassador on climate change after earning £800,000 a year as the chair of the Bank of England. Talking about climate change over there. And actually, they're talking about climate change. Any idea what they're talking about? Offsetting. There's a surprise. Rich people talking about offsetting, not about, how should I move into a smaller house? And perhaps get rid of 4 of my cars and not have a private jet. You might spot one or two other issues here about people discussing climate change, like all men in suits, all quite old, all white. Anyway, but that clique extends to professors, to CEOs of think tanks and climate committees, to policymakers, to business leaders, to senior journalists. So that clique is not just the billionaires. I have lots of colleagues and others who are in this group. So I think we have to come much closer to home and realise that. This is a quote from Frederick Bastiat, who's a contemporary of Adam Smith. So very much sort of leaning on the sort of the libertarian end of economics. But I think the quote's fantastic. When plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men and women in a society, over the course of time, they create for themselves a legal system that authorises it and a moral code that glorifies it. And I've added to that an academia that justifies it and a media that disseminates it. And capture is all but complete. So my headline conclusions are that for the UK, a 50% chance of 1.5 budget isn't possible. The rates of cuts we now are just impossible to achieve. So 1.5 has gone. And as I say, I'm saying that with a very heavy heart. And I don't think we'll get back there by negative emissions either. It also requires massive shifts in non-CO2 emissions. So when we talk about the carbon budget, that already makes assumptions that we've dramatically cut methane and other greenhouse gases as well. But liquefied natural gas, blue hydrogen, these things are locking in more methane, not reducing them. So there's real issues with that. So as I say, I don't think pursuing 1.5 is any longer possible. For well below 2 degrees centigrade, we still need huge cuts in emissions that are totally beyond anything anyone is talking about in this country. We're all reliant on negative emissions and blaming other countries. And this is true for lots of other wealthy countries. It's not just the UK. This holds true for most of the European countries and the US and so forth. The current NDCs, these promises we've all made, if you add together the promises for all the countries in the world, by the early 2030s, the chances of staying in the Paris 2 degree C framing will be where the 1.5 one is today. In other words, not possible. So within not many years, we'll be making 2 degrees centigrade, the Paris framing of 2 degrees centigrade will have gone out the window as well. So we'll be going to higher than that as a probability. The time frame for delivering major cuts in CO2 emissions is between now and 2030. By the time you get to 2030, you're pretty much locking in the 2 degrees centigrade and possibly more. And I think, again, this is missing because the academics have not got the courage to stand up to their conviction of their own conclusions, by and large anyway. So the expert community, I think, takes some significant responsibility here. What does this mean for policymakers? The IPCC, which is generally quite, and it's not a criticism of it, it's generally quite a conservative organisation, and that's the nature of science to some degree. The IPCC is split into different working groups, and this is from the adaptation working group. The mitigation working group, I think, shouldn't be there. It's really problematic. It's full of negative emission technologies and hopeful magic technologies in the future. But the adaptation one does a really good job, and the science one does as well. I think this captures it really well. Targeting a climate resilient, sustainable world involves fundamental changes to how society functions, including to underlying values, worldviews, ideologies, social structures, political economic systems, and power relationships. Everything. So, and maybe we're going through a phase where we are having to question quite a lot of things. Maybe that's not a bad thing to some degree. So perhaps we could question them and rather than think, let's just spend lots more money on arms, we could actually think of doing something different with our productive capacity and our intellect. More along the lines of this. I would argue now it's too late for non-radical futures. I've been saying this for quite a long time. The future would be radically different from the present. I see no way out of revolutionary rates of change to how we live our lives today, the we in this. The choice here is between a rapid, deep and fair decarbonisation of modern society. That's an organised-ish technical and social revolution. Or we just hang on a bit longer, ongoing lies, rhetoric, a few more gongs handed out to experts, and we exceed dangerous temperatures for all. And then will be revolutionary scales of change that will be both chaotic and violent. And I think at the moment, I think we're heading this direction. This is a quote from a Brazilian philosopher, Robert Unger, and politician actually, he was at the time. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. And of course, the future will be different. And the point is, we can shape that future. It's not shaped for us. We can shape it. I'm going to close this quote here from, I wouldn't know how to pronounce this, but Angira Mathi, and it's about her mom who was involved in does anyone know about the green belt in Kenya, the planting of trees? So it's a quote, she was just in an interview about her mother. So this is about her mom. It doesn't take a lot of people for real change to happen. At a time when so much seems to be going wrong, it is very easy to get overwhelmed. You don't need an army of people. Each of us can be agents for change. And I think collectively, we can be agents for change in our own family, in our network, in our sports club, our school, our council, wherever it might be. And that can play out wider and wider, sort of emergent ripples in the pond. I don't see the world as a top-down place. I don't see it necessarily as bottom-up. It's a partnership between those. And it's a messy partnership that is really hard to unpack and unravel. The world is emergent. We are in a complex world that is emergent, which means that we don't know who's going to be the person who triggers the changes, along with their other colleagues, friends, whoever that might be. And that gives us quite a lot of power. Trump thinks he's powerful, but is he any more powerful than a lot of other people? Probably not in many respects. So we have to think of it more like that. I'll just finish off with a couple of slides here, which might, I don't know, because this is a Green Party event, but I think citizens have an absolutely key role in this. You cannot rely on the experts necessarily to be truthful unless you hold their feet to the fire, which you should be doing. The experts know a lot of things. Engage with them, but question them, check their context. So integrity is absolutely key here. We need to abide by consistent and transparent principles that we can argue with our friends and colleagues so we understand them ourselves and have them unpicked, which is uncomfortable, but also fun over a pint in a pub. Or a coffee in a coffee shop. Cogency, apply a clear and logical reasoning to how we see the world and how we think things should be changing. Hold the feet to the fire of our MPs, our councillors, our policymakers more generally, but also companies and the media. The media have been as bad in this as the expert community has been. When I keep referring to the expert community, I'm not talking about the science of climate change. I'm talking about what we need to do about climate change, which is often scientists talking about that in a not honest fashion, or an ignorant fashion often. Courage, do not bend to align with ephemeral political sensibilities. That's everywhere now. And I say, unfortunately, the funding bodies, the universities and so forth, on mitigation, on reducing emissions, have bent to the ephemeral political sensibilities. Be prepared to counter established views, however powerful they might be. And that's easier to do if you get together in collectives. Communication, use diverse narratives, appropriate metaphors and accessible language, and get other the people we trust in society are generally people that we know well in our circle of friends, have got an accent like we have, a dialect like we have. They talk about something down the road that we recognise. So that's where trust is strongest. And so often, if you're trying to engage people on climate change, try and get people locally to talk about it. Your voices, the voices of civil society, have never been more important than they are now, because unfortunately, I think the top-down approach has failed us. On that note, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for that sobering and honest talk about what we can do about climate change. We've now got some time for some questions, and if I may, I'll start us off. Just to bring it back to a sort of local level. So lots of this feels very global and feels like it's something that's outside of our reach. And then Shropshire Council is looking more locally, and we're looking to miss our net zero goal for 2030. And lots of the argument is, well, we're a drop in this giant global ocean. And it doesn't really matter what Shropshire does, we're just one county. What message would you give to, and some councillors are here this evening, to councillors and people working on policy for this about what we can do?
Yeah. But I always argue that argument is one of the morally bereft or the mathematically illiterate. And the reason I say that is that people say, oh, the UK is only 1% or so of emissions. Okay, so's Beijing and Shanghai, so they shouldn't bother about it. The Chinese freight industry is about the same, well, less than the UK, so don't bother about Chinese freight. Aviation globally about, 2%, don't bother about aviation. The problem with those things, that 101% add up to 100%. And so everyone can argue. China can just split itself up and say, well, we don't really matter. So it is a morally bereft argument, or one of the mathematically illiterate. So of course Shropshire matters. But it not only matters from its emissions, it matters from how it demonstrates what can be done to another council. And that's the bit that brings about change. And that's why individuals matter. When we reduce our emissions, okay, by and large, for most of us, unless you're Bill Gates, someone, your emissions aren't going to really matter. But trying to make the changes yourselves, and then being honest with your friends and family about how hard it was or how easy it was, or what worked, what didn't work, that creates a dialogue that then opens up a debate that very quickly spreads beyond us. And that's the same for the council. So if the councillors have put themselves forward, presumably they think they've got some leadership skills, I expect them to be also demonstrating by example, otherwise get a different job.
Okay, thank you very much. If you have a question, you can raise your hand, and if you can, stand up and ask your question. So raise your hands if you've got questions, please. Thank you in the hat at the back.
Just to say, I think there's two things that haven't been mentioned. One of them is the sort of elephant in the room about most of these discussions, that nothing can really change unless there's fundamental changes in the economy and that capitalism is challenged. Because I can't see how we can achieve any of the things that we want to achieve to mitigate climate change and that disaster, whilst we've got an economy that puts profit before people. That's one thing. The other thing is that, I just can't see any change happening in the world unless we have a world governance of some form.
Yeah.
Because none of these things can happen just in a competitive global world where countries are competing over economic relationships, etc. We need to fashion a world governance where a fairness in terms of allocating resources and such forth are completed.
Yeah, okay. There's a hell of a lot in that. So I'll just try and make some comments on 2 bits. Sweden's changed a bit at the moment. I work a lot in Sweden. The way the Swedish economy worked up until quite recently was fundamentally different from the way the UK economy worked or the American one worked, yet they're all capitalist. So all I'm saying is that we have to be, I broadly hold to what you're saying. I think the general underlying principles of capitalism are a real problem when you're trying to live on a round planet with 8.5 billion people. I'm not sure how you can square that circle. But I also think we have to be careful to sort of paint all countries that have something that could be seen as a capitalist model as the same. There are lessons to learn that are very different. And even in the US, some of the states act quite differently. So I think capitalism is a much more complex thing than just the single term gives it. But I take your view. I mean, the ongoing economic growth, you cannot completely decouple. When people say we've decoupled economic growth from emissions, that's nonsense. They've changed the relationship a little bit. That's all we've done. They've not decoupled it. And so the degrowth argument, which I don't like the degrowth. I don't like the argument. I don't like the language of degrowth. I'd rather just move away from that sort of economic language. I'd rather just measure things in river quality, the number of geese that come each year, the security of jobs, how safe our streets are. Measure it in the things that matter, and some things that we can't measure. There are lots of things we cannot measure. We don't ever value. I mean, when you think about caring, and look at the UK. How much of our economy is caring? We never measure that, and it's probably much bigger than a lot of other sectors. And so I think we have to recognise that there are lots of things in our society today aren't capitalist, and there are different models of it. So I think we have to have a slightly more, I'm not saying you haven't thought about these things, I'm sure you have, but a slightly more nuanced, slightly more sophisticated view of where that economy needs to go to. And also that just thinking to the second bit, do we want world government? Firstly, I don't think we can't get it in the time that we couldn't get it in the time that we need. So if we're looking at this one issue here, of climate change. Governance, right. Yeah, okay. Well,
controls everything, but controls the things that are leverages.
Yeah.
Things like climate change and equality.
This is why I quite like the concept and the fundamental concept of the EU about subsidiarity. Take decisions at the most appropriate level. And so, to some extent, that's what the UNFCCC did, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The problem was that countries didn't go into it as honest players. And that was a real issue. Because there, basically, what you could be saying, and this is how I would see this, is that we know we've got a global carbon budget. The scientists from China and the US and Europe and Japan and everything, we've all broadly done the same work on this, and it comes up with similar values. So we've all worked on this. We know what the global carbon budget is. We've all said we want to stop bad levels of climate change, and we're giving a temperature to it. And we know how much we can emit. The trick then is how do you split that amongst the countries? That's the bit we're struggling with. Once we split it amongst the countries, I don't want us to tell countries how to do it. How China would respond to its carbon budget would be a very different way to how Sweden would do it. And Sweden might choose, I don't know, just voluntary agreements or very high levels of tax. We might choose something completely different over here, a trading scheme, whatever it might be. So each country will choose its policy framework that aligns with its culture, its economics, its geography, its geology, all those things play out. But the budgets have to be allocated to countries. And that's the bit that we've failed on climate change. Everyone's played poker at every one of these events. Just on that, I think there is some examples in philosophy. What you should do, you should get each country to represent another country. And you get a much higher. So if the US represented China, and China represented Japan, and Japan represented France, and France represented Rwanda, and Rwanda represented Kenya, then you get a much more honest approach of what's going on out of this. And there's some quite interesting sort of like lab-based tests of how people respond when you're doing it for someone else.
Yes, back row.
Thank you for your excellent talk. The work you did at the Tyndall Centre also was excellent. In 2020, Shropshire published a zero carbon Shropshire plan based on the budget of Shropshire. And that was worked out obviously with some equity in mind. And obviously we now need to sort of update that, and to get a reduction we've got to work to a budget. Does the Tyndall Centre have an updated budget to offer us for 2039?
Unfortunately, we've just stopped that. That was an open access process. It took a lot of resources to keep it, looking at, keep it on top of it. And the problem is that a lot of these things are changing as we're getting better understanding of the science. So you have to go back and revisit the budgets, and also we emit a lot in between. And so we hadn't got the capacity to keep on doing it. And it was basically done for free. And people have got a lot of other work, so we've had to stop that process. I think the website's still open, and I think the tool is still there for people to go and use, but it's not updated anymore, unfortunately. I've always come to a point where you can just look at the sort of numbers for the UK. If Shropshire wanted to make its fair contribution to Paris, a 2-degree C framing of Paris, it needs to reduce emissions at, I'm not saying it's to be 13% or 11% or 15%, but that sort of ballpark. And that's no matter whether you're Shropshire, whether you're the South London, whether you're Suffolk, whether you're Fife, whether you're wherever it happens to be, you need to cut emissions at 10 to 15% per annum as an absolute minimum to get us anywhere near the fair contribution to 2 degrees centigrade. And you do also have to think some of the other complicated issues, like roads go through your territory. These are some really difficult, thorny issues for councils to deal with here. If you've got a big road going through, whose responsibility is that? Is that if you're like Manchester, you've got an airport, people from Shropshire might fly from Manchester Airport. Who takes the responsibility for that? Manchester or Shropshire? Now, there are ways of dealing with that via postcodes and other things, but these are also issues that we need to really be addressing, and we're not, unfortunately. So I'm sorry, we're not producing those budgets anymore, but 10 to 15% per annum is what you should be aiming at, starting from this year. And every year you fail, the percentage the following year gets higher.
Yes, on this side.
What are the positive feedback mechanisms that we should be worried about?
Well, one or two of them terrified about, possibly. I would say AMOC is one, which is always terrible language we use. I've got to remember that. The Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which is, some people think of as the Gulf Stream, but Gulf Stream is just a bit of it. And basically AMOC is the movement of heat around the planet in the oceans. And that's absolutely fundamental to how our climate operates. And so there's some really interesting, this used to be thought that we wouldn't collapse AMOC. Without AMOC, like the UK would be like Labrador. I think London would be like Labrador in terms of we could have winters that were like -10 to -20. Imagine that in our wonderful houses. Yeah, lots of dead people. So we could not cope with those sorts of temperatures, not without absolute trauma. And that used to be thought of as a very small chance. Now the people working on AMOC think that could happen in the next handful of decades. Now we don't know it will, but that is a very real risk that in a warming world, continental Europe could get diabolically cold winters and still very hot summers. That's something. It's something to be scared about. But what does that tell us? Stop emitting, because the higher emissions get, the higher the probability is of these things happening. And so that they all come back to that. So that's a really important feedback. Things where we see like the absorption of roughly half of the CO2 we put in the atmosphere gets taken up, a quarter of it by the oceans and a quarter of it by the biosphere, by photosynthesis and plants and so forth. And that's changing. So we're seeing in the Amazon, we're seeing a mixture with deforestation and changes in climate and warming and so forth. We're seeing potentials for Amazon, for the dieback. We might be seeing that in the Congo, but we've got very poor data on it. The problem, those places are absorbing huge amounts of carbon dioxide and have lots of carbon dioxide locked into them, which could be released. So if you start to get those parts of the world that are a key part of maintaining that balance, if they start to become sources of CO2, that's a real problem. It's the same with the oceans. If the oceans warm up to certain levels, as you warm up the oceans, they can't hold as much CO2. They start gassing it into the atmosphere. There's far more CO2 in the oceans than there is in the atmosphere. And so there's a whole suite of these feedbacks that are out there that can make the situation far, far worse than we're in now, which is why we need to avoid them. We don't know exactly where they are. Some people will give you some precise, that happens at 1.7 degrees, that one at 1.9. That's nonsense. We don't know exactly. All we know, they're roughly in the sort of ballpark where we're heading at the moment. And the higher the temperature goes, the higher the probability is that they'll occur. So any person who's got an IQ that's double figures will say, don't go there. But we appear to be brilliant at charting our own demise, but appalling at actually stopping it.
Yes,
What do I tell my grandchildren without terrifying them?
Well, I think it's interesting. Is it the jury's out? I think from what when I talk to some of my psychology friends, and they often just disagree with each other. That's why I say the jury's out as to whether terrifying them might not be a bad thing. I mean, within reason, about how old your grandchildren are. But that some people respond well to fear, as to other people it paralyses them. So I think we have to be very careful to think there's one message we should give out. I think the point we have to be is honest. And if you know your grandchildren, you know how they respond to things, so you have to find your way to take an honest message to them. But I think one thing to point out to them is that the adults in the room have been deeply childish for the last 30 or 40 years on climate change. So perhaps that your grandchildren need to step up to the plate, because sadly they haven't. The adults in the room haven't done that. Now, that doesn't mean saying you give up on the adults. The adults have got to do things, so we have to put pressure on the adults. And unfortunately, the adults have the lever. Maybe unfortunate. The adults have the levers in our society still, and so they need to put pressure on us to push things in the right direction. So it's a dialogue between you and your grandchildren, and get them involved in politics. They have to stand for be a politician, but politics in its broadest meaning is hugely important. We're in an incredibly privileged country here. It's still a democracy. We generally don't get taken out and our families disappear. We can engage, and collectively come together. You can be incredibly powerful at driving change. Remember, your MPs require your votes. It doesn't take many of you people to start to campaign against an MP and they lose their seat. They don't want that. So we have a lot of power. The trick with the people in power is to make us think we have none, and then they can just stay there as long as they want. And so get your grandchildren to engage with it politically, and possibly engage in it from a work point of view, an employment point of view, or a voluntary point of view as well. It might be uncomfortable for you as well when they. And just because are there any? That's a bit odd to say this, but are there any women in the room that ask questions? I don't mean to be patronising. I've got colleagues of mine that say that if you ask a woman first, then loads of women put their hands up. If you ask a man first, women don't put their hands up. I don't know why that is. Sorry, some of my social science colleagues point out that, and they adopt this approach now. If you ask a woman at the beginning for a question, they put their hand up and you ask them a question. Lots of other women will ask questions. If the first person to ask a question is a man, lots more men put their hand up and not so many women. It's just a sort of, I don't know, some sort of generic cultural norm that we have. Anyway, we're proving it wrong now.
So I was thinking on that too, actually. I did want to ask a question anyway, but I also felt that a woman should ask a question. So I wanted to ask a question about metrics, and more importantly, how metrics can be used to drive use of change. So you talked about at the beginning about the fact that temperature is a fairly crap proxy for what we're really interested in, and in terms of the impacts, and then also linking to the first part of Pat's point about your answer to Pat's point about growth, and the fact that we use GDP. Well, I say the world uses GDP as this metric that drives a lot of behaviour, a lot of activity. And I'm aware of the sort of movement to move away from GDP to something that's more meaningful, and the things that we are actually interested in. And I wondered what your view are about, well, partly about communicating with the public, and what metrics other than temperature are meaningful for communicating to the public, but also about the movement to move away from GDP, and whether you've got a view on how successful that movement is being. Do you think it's actually a useful approach? Do you think it's making traction, and can it make traction in the kind of time frame that we need?
Yeah. Okay. Right. So let's tackle the GDP one. I said before about degrowth. Degrowth is a different way to think about the economy. I just don't like the idea. It's still sort of measuring things in a financial way. I'd rather. It's not all like that. It's a very sophisticated sort of literature on degrowth. Some really good people working on it. But I quite like that way of moving away from. It's not the economy, it's finance. I mean, the economy comes from the Greek oikonomia, which is the stewardship of the household. We need more of that. What we need less of is finance, which is just basically astrology. So if we could wrestle the economy back from finance, that would be quite helpful, I think. And the economy is not about GDP. The people that put forward the idea of GDP never wanted it to be used like it is today. And in fact, really, who uses GDP? Evan Davis on that terrible PM programme on Radio 4 uses GDP, is obsessed by it, but none of us are. We don't give a damn about GDP. Well, all my close friends who never didn't go to university, but none of them give a damn about GDP. It's not a useful metric. It's handy for a few of these people to talk about, for the press to be obsessed by, for some nonsense on the radio. Oh, in the last quarter, we're up by 0.3% on GDP. Meaningless nonsense. It's just astrology. And we have to treat it with that disdain, that disregard. And I don't think most of the public are interested in GDP. They're interested in jobs. They're interested in security. Those are the things that matter to us. So we shouldn't over-privilege GDP because it isn't meaningful to most people. It's only meaningful to this select clique who somehow think they can keep the rest of us down and quiet by talking about this nonsense to do with GDP. And so I think it's our job just to ignore it, to get away from it and talk about other things. Now, I'm not saying we might have different views to what we want to use to measure a successful society. I mean, some people use measures of happiness. Look how happy the Finns are. And, so there are measures out there. And I would say those metrics, well, it's just a measure of happiness. It's a damn sight more reliable than GDP. And go look back where GDP came from. It was never designed to be used the way it is today. And only certain groups of people use it. The rest of us get about our lives and never think about it. It's not an issue. And I think we need to be doing much more of that. And again, that's because we can engage as citizens in a society, it's a democracy, we can push that agenda. But there's lots of stuff written out there on, say, the degrowth agenda, the steady state stuff from Herman Daly, really good stuff. There's a wealth of work out there some of it quite accessible. It's often written in a bit technical language about other ways to think about our economy. And the first part was...
It was just about meaningless proxies.
The proxies, yeah. Temperature. Yeah. The reason I say it's meaningless is that when people say, it's 1.5 degrees, from a day-to-day person, from someone who doesn't, they've got a proper job and they don't bother about climate change, other than, yes, let's do something about it. To them, you talk about these temperatures, it seems ridiculous, and quite reasonably so, because they see these fluctuations all the time in temperature. And so I think it would be more helpful if we start to talk about something like local impacts. Local impacts are really important. People are getting engaged on local impacts. So trying to think, how do these global temperatures, how do they play out for local impacts? Thinking about those sorts of sets of issues and sort of nesting them. So, for instance, the risk, most people have got we're not great at risk as a population, but we have some handle of risk. And so if you start to talk about AMOC, not calling it AMOC, explain roughly what it is and how that might massively affect our food and how it means that the supermarkets in Shrewsbury would be very expensive, if not nothing on the shelves. So to start to talk about how these global things break down to us locally, I think is really important. So I have colleagues here, social science colleagues, who say, talking about polar bears and penguins isn't particularly helpful if we're engaging a lot of people on climate change. So other people are engaged by that, but on average, bringing it local gets people much more engaged in these sets of issues. And I think the sort of global stuff that I'm talking about here, the way I frame it, is great for an audience like this, but not for a lot of people. So I think it's your job to engage with the populations and people that you know who aren't as au fait with the issues as you are.
We have time for about one more question, and you may choose whoever you like to answer the final question. The final questions.
Well, that lady there's had her hand up. Sorry about this, but longer than that.
Okay, thank you. This kind of links to the question earlier about grandchildren. So I've had the privilege of working with a lot of youth activists in the last few years, interviewing them. And actually, I have a question about, because you mentioned this lack of imagination or a kind of clear pathway forwards. But actually, I think for anyone working in climate space or community space, I think we meet a lot of people who want to do more, but don't know what to do. And for young people who are entering the world of work, I think increasingly, particularly if they're concerned about environment, it's really not clear what they can do. And I think we're seeing a growing number of young people switching off who don't want to enter the workforce. And I'm sure there are individuals here who thought about that with their own careers, who don't want to be part of this architecture. You kind of alluded in academia that this architecture means that you can end up being part of the system that's causing this disruption. So I guess my question is, do you have an idea of what this looks like, this transition? Because we're part of this shift, but what is that positive vision for the many of us in here, and young people in particular, like entering the world of work? What can they do? Because actually I think there are communities organising on climate locally here too. There's quite exclusive groups. We don't have the mechanisms of citizens' assemblies yet, perhaps, to allow more participation. So I'm kind of passing it back to you. What is this positive vision that you can give young people and everyone here? What can people do?
Well, I mean, your point about citizens' assemblies is really important. I mean, pushing for that sort of thing, and being very careful that the boundaries in those citizens' assemblies are not set by people who are deliberately trying to constrain the narrative and the degree of imagination. So I'm going to say this, even though I know one of the people deeply involved with it would strongly disagree with me, but the UK one was basically set by the Committee on Climate Change. The boundaries were set by them, and therefore the questions fit within them. I worked very heavily with the Scottish one, and I had to fight tooth and nail to have the boundaries removed from what's net zero for 2045. That's not in their act. It's about safe and fair climate change. Well, okay, ask about that then. So the boundaries in citizens are really important. The other part about what the vision is, this sounds a bit like a cop-out, and it goes back to one of the points I said before. I genuinely think our society is a very complex place. Not complicated, it's complicated as well, but complex, which means we don't know where things will go. It innately has something that in science and physics we call emergent properties. And we're being brought up in the Enlightenment, which has taught us that the world's reductionist, that we can see where things go if we're clever enough. Well, when it gets complex, you can't. Now, that sounds hopeless in some respects, but otherwise it's actually very hopeful. Because there isn't a vision about out there, that's the vision we need to aim for. Some of the people you speak will have time to get them to think about the vision that's good for them. Not necessarily just good for them, but the vision they think would be positive for society. But someone else over there might have a different one. And so we should have much more eclectic ways to think about the future. And it should be guided by some principles. So what are those principles, really? I mean, I may touch them towards the end. Honesty, integrity, a moral code, fairness. And these are things that, by and large, most people share. They're not that different. When you really talk to people, even people across quite wide political divides, they might have different ways of bringing it about. And that's interesting, because that's different visions. And that might be really important. But I think the fundamental deep characteristics that we have, the values are very much shared. And there's differences, but there's lots of similarities. So play to those similarities, and let's paint lots of good visions, and then look for other ones that are a bit like yours and collectively come together. So collectives are massively powerful. The trick about a neoliberal framing of the world is it's atomized us. It makes us into individuals. We're not individuals, we're citizens. And citizens can work collectively. And when citizens work collectively, they're incredibly powerful. But I won't want to dictate what the vision is that your citizens that you're engaged with should have. I do think we should be trying to say, well, what do you think are the underlying values of that system, the vision that you want to have? We should discuss those things. But I feel that when we do that, and I think it's an important starting point, they'll be quite similar. So we'll have similar starting points, and we might then have a different set of visions. And we might then think, God, I never thought of that. That's really interesting. And at the moment, I don't think we know how to get out of where we are. We can know the bones, like the sort of thing I'm putting out, but quite how we make that shift, we don't really know. And I would say at the moment, because things have sort of just been, because of some, I mean, not just because of, but he's the product of a lot of other things that have gone on. But because we've suddenly got someone who's very unpredictable in the White House, lots of things are thrown in the air, including on the economy. Interesting enough, someone like him cannot be bought. I mean, he's so full of himself. Unlike a lot of other politicians, the Bidens of this world and a lot of the other politicians, effectively been bought. You've now got someone who hasn't been, and he's causing ructions by his nonsensical way of engaging. Maybe there's something in there. Maybe this is one of those sort of moments. This is a potential tipping point where society can look at what's happening, and then prise open those gaps that are there, and have more productive light come out of it. It's a Leonard Cohen quote, isn't it? Then from the cracks. It's out of the cracks is where the light comes from, and perhaps we're seeing those cracks in the system today. And the light is the visions that you have with the people you're working with and with other people. So I can't give you an answer. I can't give you a vision. But I think we can look for hope in where we are, and the fact that the people you engage with want to think about the future. And don't try and take away I don't think we should have false hope. I completely disagree with this hopium view of the world, which is what climate change is full of. But we shouldn't despair. I mean, you don't have to work on climate change. You can work in teaching and teach other subjects, and you can bring good moral codes into that. You can become a nurse. You can run a company. You can all sorts of things you can do, and bring good values and good characteristics to that organisation. So I often get asked about careers advice, and I don't want everyone to go off and work on climate change. What boring world that'd be. You know, you want people to be comedians. You want people to be welders. You need people to, you know, we need those eclectic set of skills that we have. And so I really find it slightly depressing if they're thinking there's nothing I can do as a child with huge prospects in front of me. The world's full of all things where we need their contribution, driven by good values. And I suppose it comes down to that. It's talk to them about values. And then I think we might solve these climate issues and the ecological ones and some of the social ones as well. That sounds a bit like a cop-out, perhaps. I don't mean it to be.